Great.
Great. Fantastic. All right. So I don't know what Luli has told you so far, but my name is Visa. I am from Singapore, and my friends have been trying to get me to read your book for like a year now, and I got a copy in the mail like 3 days ago, and I read it all at once a couple of days ago. I loved it.
Cool.
And there's so much I have so many things to talk to you about that I have to prioritize. And I think what's most interesting is that we have really different backgrounds. So I mean, I've read up as much as I could about all your interviews and stuff, and it's I really appreciate your scientific background and your theoretical physics and that stuff that I'm a curious layperson about, but I don't have a strong foundation in. So when I'm reading it, it makes sense to me, but I don't have the kind of deep contexts to really fully appreciate it. But I mean, so okay, what I wanted to talk to you about is about optimism, and I find that, and a thing that I found quite amusing is throughout your book you use the word parochial a lot.
Yes.
Right, which is I enjoy that, and I was hoping to dig into that with you a little bit. So I mean, for some more context, so what people know me on Twitter for and on the internet for is just kind of a I'm known as the guy who tries to cultivate this sort of digital intellectual coffee house sort of space where I invite friends from all over the world, different perspectives, different interests. And I think we have similar interests in that I want to help accelerate progress in every sense, right? And reading your book, I find myself thinking, yes, I want more good explanations. I want more conjectures. I want to help foster a culture of criticism. And yeah, I just would like to hear from you about your experiences doing that, kind of like talking to people about these ideas. Or, I mean, okay, I guess what I would be most curious about is how do you think about, let's say, parochialism? Like what is your relationship with that? How is it a very deliberate choice, that word, or
Okay, so parochialism. I've recently discovered that the word parochialism doesn't really exist in languages other than English. It originally meant
parish,
having
right?
something to do with the parish or with the local religious authorities, as opposed to the central religious authorities. So that's what it originally meant.
Interesting.
And in English, it has come, and that word exists in many languages.
Right.
But in English, it has come to have, and is much more often now used in a figurative sense, to mean having too narrow a horizon, especially having too narrow an intellectual horizon. And I should say that having a broad horizon is not a virtue in itself. It all depends on the problem situation. What I mean by parochial is is a point of view or a way of thinking that is more narrow than the problem dictates.
Right.
And one of my mottos is, all problems are parochial. Some solutions are universal.
Interesting.
But
That's
most
true.
aren't.
That's true. Yeah.
So that I don't know if that's what you wanted, but that's how I came to use parochial a lot.
I love it. I really like that you just said that having a broader horizon is not necessarily optimal in a sense, right? Because I've encountered people over the years who they almost seem to sometimes so they begin with the assumption that bigger and broader is better, and which again, like I think you pointed out, it's not, it's generally kind of it's often good, but like I found people sometimes using it almost as a distraction from dealing with some particular problem that they would need solving. And then it's kind of like,
Yes.
we have some problem that we need to solve, but because it's challenging or difficult or whatever, it becomes tempting to try and kind of frame the problem in a much more broad and vague way, such that it can't really be solved maybe. But like it's really cool that you mentioned that, because I think it's been challenging to find an intuitive way to convey that to people, that sometimes like, so the general case seems to be that people tend to frame their problems too narrowly, but there's also this kind of minority of people who do the opposite, and they instead of addressing the challenges in front of them, they kind of get distracted from it and seek broader perspectives.
Yes, I mean it leads to infinity eventually.
Mm-hmm.
If you're writing a computer program and
Right.
you want a function to do so and so, and you think, oh well, maybe it would be better if I made it more general, so I'll put another parameter in the function, and then you say, well, I could make it even more general. Then I'll abstract over something or other, and then I'll invent a tool to help me abstract and so on.
Yes.
Eventually.
Yes.
The thing you actually wanted to do was add two numbers together.
Yeah, that's true. And another thing that I wanted to discuss with you was your chapter on creativity. So I consider myself very much a fan of creativity, and I love that you also seem to appreciate that, you know, it's not just an artsy thing. It's like science is progressed by creative conjectures and having creative ideas. And yeah, I want to see more of that. And and even very recently, I've gotten into kind of boring and frustrating disagreements about, you know, kind of the building blocks of creativity. So some people feel that. So one of my riffs is that you know, to some degree, all creativity is a remix, or like a, you know, like just rearranging what you have, but also you ask new questions that you couldn't conceive of before, right?
Yes, it could be a remix with variations.
Yes, exactly.
So
right, and
everything is based on existing things, but mixing them around and varying them then to fit the problem.
Correct. Yeah, and it's again, I run into a similar problem again, where if the other person in the conversation, or, you know, if it's if we are workshopping trying to solve a problem together, and someone gets kind of fixated on what a creative solution would look like, I think it's one of those traps where people try too hard to stick to a certain frame, or a certain how would you say, like an encapsulation of the challenge ahead of them. And I sense that you would have had experience persuading people to adjust their point of view to be more constructive. Have you? I'm projecting, like
maybe. I generally speaking, I don't want to like I don't want to influence people. I don't want to save the world or save people. I just have some ideas, some guesses about how the world works, how thinking works, how physics works, and so on. And in some cases, I've thought about it a lot, and I think that some existing ideas about this are wrong. And so I'm like, but that's wrong because so and so. But then the object of the conversation, I think, is not primarily to persuade people. It's to exchange ideas.
Yes.
And not even necessarily. I mean, so persuading people is nice. Learning things from other people is nice.
Yes.
That does not exhaust the possibilities. That's not even the main purpose to me of a conversation. The main purpose is just the fun of exchanging ideas. And you could call that learning something, but it's not it's not necessarily, what did you learn from this conversation?
Right.
It's not that kind of learning.
Yes, it's playful, right?
Yes.
And yeah, so so even now talking about this with you, like the perspective that you hold, it feels unusual. It feels like it's refreshing to talk with someone who kind of so like you said, I just have ideas. I'm not trying to change the world or trying to, like not hankering for an outcome specifically. And I find that that's, I wish that were more common. And I find that it's not as common as I wish it were. So I think in the past, I used to approach a lot of conversations with, why don't you see my point of view? Or why don't you do that? And I think over time, I have come to, all right, if where we are in this conversation, it's not moving, we're not having fun, it's not enjoyable. I should just find someone else and kind of keep looking for new people to play with, basically.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how, so do you share that assessment that it's not very common? And do you have like a hypothesis for why it's not that common? I mean, you've written about it, but I'd love to hear it from you.
I think it's not very common. And I think the reason is like all or nearly all errors to do with knowledge, it comes from aspects of wrong epistemology or wrong philosophy of knowledge that are embedded in culture, in language and everything, so that we will take them for granted unless we really think about them. And this is what Karl Popper did for us.
Right.
He realized that there are various things that are deeply wrong with the prevailing theory of knowledge. So, for example, one thing that would already do what you're talking about, that would already make people make that mistake, is what Popper calls the bucket theory of the mind.
The bucket
Theory of knowledge.
Right.
Which is that knowledge is a kind of fluid which one can transfer from one person to another. And then if you think of knowledge that way, it perverts everything. You automatically start thinking of a conversation as being a task of transferring something from your mind into the other person's mind, or maybe vice versa. But that's all it can be. And if it goes wrong, it's because either the fluid was polluted, the knowledge fluid was polluted with bad stuff, or because the person receiving it is too stubborn to open their mind to it.
Right.
And this whole conception completely defines away the fact that minds are creative and critical. So once you've removed, this concept of knowledge as a fluid removes the idea that minds are both creative and critical. When you've removed those two things, you can be trained to do something or not, and that's it. You can't create.
Yeah, it's a very zero sum kind of mindset. And when I was reading your book, I was struck by how at one point you even just casually mentioned like something as simple as a nuclear fusion reactor that our current knowledge doesn't allow us to do. And that was just kind of a throwaway point. And reading that, I found myself thinking, yes, why do I not go about my day thinking nuclear fusion reactors are possible? Like it doesn't even occur to me to think that. And it's a trip to realize that I have already been kind of inhabiting these like limited spaces in my mind about what is possible and what is not. So it's an imagination deficit in a way, right? Like and so I sense that so again, it's like what we just described, which is most people kind of not being very creative in their conversations or thinking, or not being very imaginative. That's kind of, it's something to be a little bit sad about, maybe, or something to be just kind of slightly disappointed by. But at the same time, what you pointed out is that for the vast majority of human history, it seems like most people were not capable of that, probably, or they were
Yes.
funneled their creativity. I
Yes,
love,
yes,
yeah.
they were severely disabled in that respect. I mean, never completely.
Mm-hmm.
All humans always have been creative and able to improve.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, when you've got the weight of a static society
Right.
bearing down on you, and when you do think of something, you think you're the only person in the world ever to think that, and therefore
Right.
you must be wrong. You know, whatever.
Yeah.
Then it's no wonder that very little progress was made. But still, even in such societies,
Right.
in the past, where they had, you know, inconceivably little little infrastructure,
Right.
I mean cultural infrastructure to rest on, people still did make progress.
Right.
You know, but somebody invented fire. Wasn't even a human. It was a previous species.
Right.
Some previous species.
Yeah.
We don't know what species. And
Right.
somebody invented fire, which takes a hell of a lot of doing.
Yeah.
You have to be able to think very abstractly.
Right. There's this terrible joke that goes something like, the person who invented fire was probably burnt at the stake for it. Kind
It
of.
might well be true.
Which is kind of a, you know, it's, I think that is like, so while that's a joke, I think there's a general theme of, I think even with, you know, Fritz Haber, right, with like when he came up with ammonia, you simultaneously invent fertilizer and like weapons, right, chemical weapons.
Yes.
And it's kind of a, you know, as a scientist trying to create more knowledge and grappling with the implications of, you can't entirely control how other people are going to use that knowledge, right? Because if they don't have the cultural, what are your thoughts about that? About, you know, kind of some people call it like info hazards.
Yes, I think it's not at all unlikely that the person who invented fire regretted it.
Right.
They were either, you know, they probably wouldn't have invented burning at the stake by then, but they might have been killed for it.
Right.
And there would have been a non-trivial argument because that person would have had to violate some tradition to do this.
Yes.
And the violating tradition would have been dangerous.
Right.
So it's like, you know, one person decides to mess around with, it's thought that the first fire was made by varying a spear hardening technique, where you rub the tip of the spear, you know, and somebody else might have decided to tame the local saber-toothed tiger.
Right.
And that would have been a bad idea, as we now know. But fire is also dangerous.
Right.
So it's not obvious that the first 2 or 3 or 10 uses of fire didn't do harm.
Right.
They might have.
Yeah.
So it's true of all knowledge. All creativity is dangerous.
Yes.
All knowledge is dangerous.
Yes.
I mean, it seems trite to say it, but staticity, not creating knowledge, is worse than dangerous. It's suicidal. That's the only thing we could do that is guaranteed to kill us.
Oh, okay, right, yeah, because like the Easter Island problem, right? Like where you without the culture of learning and solving new problems, eventually it's inevitable that some problem will be insoluble and crush you, basically.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's funny because I'm thinking now about how, you know, so I've always been kind of paying lip service to the idea of creativity, like just very, very superficially. Oh, it's good to be creative. It's good to experiment and have fun. Like in a very, like, I just advocate for it because I like music and art and all of those things. But like I almost I had a moment where I had to step back and think about it, where I realized that when you encourage people to be creative, you are like 2 steps down the line, you're encouraging them to do things that may be taboo, to do things that may be
Yes.
culturally insensitive. So you're like you said, it's dangerous. So you're advocating for people to do dangerous things. And again, it's like that. And when I then recoil a little bit at that thought, that too is informed by this cultural infrastructure of, oh, so like danger bad, right? But danger bad in some senses, but without the ability to solve problems, that's bigger bad, right? Like what?
Yes.
So it's an interesting challenge. So the challenge, as I see it, is how can we get better at teaching the world? Or I mean, not necessarily, like forcing people, but like demonstrating that small danger in creativity is good, basically, right? Like it's a challenge.
Yes. One thing is that people should be free to choose how much danger
Yes. Yes.
So if you've got a lot of money, like if you're a billionaire, you can either like invest your money, make sure that your business is secure in its in its supply chain and
Right.
in its customer base and
Yes,
so on,
yes.
and then eventually sell your stake and retire and so on.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
you can decide to go to Mars.
Right. Yes.
And even though you're a billionaire, you have to borrow a lot more money so that you risk being ruined financially. You risk
ridicule,
death, either for yourself or for your volunteers.
Right.
You risk being criticized because you're violating tradition.
Right. Yes.
And I don't, I don't want to give people advice to where to put themselves on the spectrum of risk.
Right.
I'm glad when people behave optimistically, but I'm aware that they are taking a risk, and I'm ready for it to go wrong.
Yes. Yeah. That is true. And there's this thing. So one of my friends asked me to ask you about coercion, like in the general sense. I think his specific question was, how do we avoid self-coercion? But I'm also thinking about it in terms of like what you just said, in that you don't want to tell someone else how much risk they should take, because then if it doesn't work out, then they'll I mean, it's they'll blame you, or it wasn't really their informed decision, and it just it doesn't feel correct in some way. I'm kind of projecting my feelings, right? But I sense that you have the same instinct, sort of.
Well, self-coercion, like, that's a big issue. That's like viewed as non-parochially as possible.
Right.
Self-coercion, it covers all unhappiness.
Wow.
So, well, if you've got an incurable disease, then self-coercion is not. Although it's true that you're also self-coercing in that case.
Right.
You also need techniques of medical science and so on. And if the knowledge might not be there, you're going to die.
Right.
But that's not the typical human problem, especially nowadays.
Right.
The typical human problem is psychological.
Right. Yes.
And therefore the typical human unhappiness, which isn't caused by other humans' creativity, which that still happens a lot in the world.
Yeah.
But the unhappiness which is not caused by the creativity of other humans, chasing you, trying to hurt you,
right,
is caused by self-coercion. And so I don't know whether I can say very much one thing I can say is that realizing this
Mm.
is liberating.
Yes.
If
Yeah.
you think, if you're in a situation where you're unhappy, you think you're no good as a person, you think you can't succeed, and you don't realize that these prefixes, you think,
Right.
like that I just said, the way you conceive of it is that I'm no good as a person, I'm not going to succeid, I haven't got it what it takes, and so on.
Yes.
Once you realize that those are theories,
Right.
and that there's no authority in theories, they might be true or false,
right,
they can all be criticized,
right,
and any bad theory can be improved by thinking.
Yes.
If you're prepared to expand your horizon to include that possibility.
Right. Yeah. I think it's accurate to say that. So when a person experiences self-loathing, so they experience it as negative, just seemingly negative feelings out of nowhere. But like there is a part of the self doing the loathing of the rest of the self.
Yes.
And the part that's doing the loathing is the authority that has been granted. I mean, it is some part of your mind that you've granted authority, and you should question those.
Exactly.
You should question that authority, as with all authorities. Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
That's so true. That's very cool. Yeah. Another thing I kind of just wanted to share with you was I was reading this part about how you pointed out that, so people often describe, space is uninhabitable and hostile to humanity, and you pointed out that so is Earth. Most of the Earth, most times it's hostile, and we have made it more habitable. And whether or not a space is hostile is a function of the knowledge that the person has or people have in terms of how do you get water, how do you get power, how do you get all those things.
Yes.
I wanted to share with you that this seems to be also true for cultural knowledge. So the example I recently encountered was, do you know Trevor Noah? So Trevor Noah is this. He's a South African. I have a book. He's a South African comedian, and so he was born to a black mom and a white dad in South Africa when apartheid was happening. And his observation is very interesting. He observed that because he doesn't fit into one of the dominant groups that is around him, and so like people would not know how to treat him, and like they would treat him with hostility until he can speak their language. And the moment he speaks their language, suddenly he has the cultural knowledge. He can speak their shibboleths, right? He can speak their like what they like, and now they welcome him and they love him, and it's that's why he's a comedian, and it's how he charms people and stuff. And yeah, so the ability to charm a hostile audience is knowledge the same. It feels to me it's almost the same way like knowing how to get water out of the ground, for example, kind of helps people survive.
I agree.
Yeah, which is such a, again, for me that was a trip. Like really when I was reading your book, I was thinking all of these things, seemingly different things, they all fit into this. They are like branches on the same tree of explanations and conjectures, right? Or conjectures. It's just like, how do I get people to like me or treat me fairly? Like, what is their theory of who I am, and how do I? And it's the same method of figuring stuff out, which I find very.
By the way, sorry, go on.
No, that's all. Yeah, you're saying?
Yeah, well, it's partly it's a two-way street to a large extent. A culture can be more or less amenable to welcoming deviant people.
Right. Yes, that's
including
true.
Foreigners, people who don't speak the language, or people who don't understand the customs or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's so being welcoming to other people, cultures,
outsiders,
etc.,
different,
is part of general rationality and so on. And I think it's not an accident that the most successful societies
Mm-hmm.
are also the most tolerant ones, or vice versa.
Right.
The
Right.
ones who have somehow solved the problem of how to accommodate deviance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's
And
true.
how to so well the big example is the United States,
Mm-hmm.
which had its melting pot policy,
Right.
but also Britain is a tremendous mixture of
Mm-hmm.
different cultures.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know much about Singapore, but I think
It
Singapore
is.
also is.
Yes.
I don't know.
Very. Yeah. Very much so. Yes. It is. I mean, people have. There's friction, but I think it's a constructive friction overall. Like it
Right.
does feel like over the decades, people have gotten better at kind of interfacing with each other. I mean, you always hear stories from people who don't get along, but in general, I think just having more people with different backgrounds and different points of view and different uh, conceptualizations of the issues that we face, it seems to be a net positive, and it seems to be working out generally.
Yes, I mean, as I said, it's definitely a net positive in itself, but
Mm-hmm.
the overall culture must make this possible.
Right.
It must allow
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
benefit to
Yeah.
be
Mm-hmm.
obtained.
Mm-hmm. A thing that I'm very excited about is, so I like to think of myself as someone who grew up on the internet, and the internet is almost kind of it's a wild and crazy, chaotic space. And the interesting thing is there are new people coming online who weren't online not too long ago. So for example, I have some friends in several different countries in Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa. And the interesting thing to me is they are generally very young, and they are very optimistic about politics. I mean, again, like when I say this now, I can imagine someone showing up in the comments saying, like, there'll always be people who, like you said, you pointed out very much so that we will never solve all problems because there'll always be new problems and there'll always be
Yes.
frictions and all those things. But it's so refreshing just to encounter someone who is kind of new to the political process, in a sense, like in terms of like being like in your early 20s and new to contemplating just how a better form of governance maybe can lead to more like which is again related to what you're saying about like cultural infrastructure, which is just and me from halfway across the planet, when I witness these people being optimistic in contrast with, let's say, people from maybe older countries that have gotten a bit more pessimistic, maybe, like just the I guess what I'm getting at is the simple presence of an optimistic person just being optimistic without even trying to persuade you of anything, but just being optimistic in of themselves is so powerful to experience. And like I feel like reading your book, I got some of that as well. Just witnessing kind of how you think, right?
Thanks,
Which is
thanks. It's a very nice thought in general, and about my
yeah,
book. Thank you.
yeah. So I
um,
am eager to share it with more of my friends, because I think that yeah, it's so much better than telling people what they should do, because if like you get it, right? It's like, so the like you mentioned the bucket analogy. I think the different metaphor is the fire analogy. Have you heard that one? Like the kind of
don't think so.
so I think someone said, I can't remember who. I feel like there's multiple people who've been quoted this, and they said like education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. Meaning, like, so you ignite
Ah,
their curiosity, and then they will go on to.
yeah. I mean, it's more like trying to avoid putting out the fire, and
Yeah.
obviously the fire is
Yes.
already there.
Yes. They're
If
born with
it
it.
wasn't there, children would be unable to learn to speak.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
you can't say go put out the trash
Right.
to a child who hasn't yet learned what go and put and trash mean.
Yes.
And yet nobody has to force their children to learn to language.
Yes. Yes. They learn,
So
but yeah.
the fire is already burning.
Mm,
Young children learn language at like 20 words per day at peak.
yeah,
Uh,
that's
and
true.
that plus the grammar, plus the meanings, plus the connotations, plus the cultural significance of everything,
Mm,
what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. They're learning
yes,
all that along with those 20 words per day.
astounding. Yeah.
And there's no curriculum.
Mm.
There are no standardized tests, or maybe they do have them now, but that
Oh
would be
dear.
terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And it just happens. And so when you say, the role of the teacher is to light that fire,
Right.
first, the fire is already there. The first
Yes.
thing is
So
don't
important.
put out the fire.
Right. So it's yeah, and it does seem unfortunate that we haven't yet. I mean, and yeah, it's how you look at it, right? So on one hand, I think, oh, it's unfortunate that we still seem to put out a lot of fires, but on the other hand, like the most of human history was like that, and we are seeing the beginning of infinity, right? Basically,
Yes.
which is exciting. And yeah, so I wanted to also ask you kind of so I have some notes here of stuff to ask you. And one of the things I wanted to ask was I want to know what's it like inside your head, which is, it's this super vague question that's kind of not technical. It's not solvable, but like I'll give it an analogy, which is, so I play the guitar, I play music. I'm not very good at it. I'm pretty decent at it. But when I see a virtuoso, like a real musical genius performing, I can see that they don't think about what they're doing. Like and I see that the way their hands move, I can tell that, they have a feeling, and the feeling is expressed through the fingers and through the sound waves and emotions and whatever. And I can kind of approximate, because like when I practice, I get glimpses of that. I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm getting across a message. I have to think a little bit, and sometimes I have moments of flow, and I feel like, oh, okay, so that's what I can try to imagine what it would be like to be so fluent that I don't have to think at all, and I'm just flowing, sort of. And I when I was reading your, just even your first chapter, and I was reading about like just how you were laying out kind of a history of philosophy, in a sense, or history of knowledge, and kind of the misconceptions, and how like I was surprised even at how confidently you were able to say things like, let me pick out a sentence, like we never know any data before interpreting it through theories. I underline that, and I'm like, oh, that's true. Like that sound like, so when I read a sentence like that, I'm like, that's an assertion. And then I read it, I'm like thinking about it, I'm like, that makes sense though. And then I have to process it for a while. I'm like, yeah, that's true. And it's so interesting to, so I guess I'm curious about your experience as a thinker, as a writer, as a person who makes utterances, right, or makes conjectures. And I just read this Paul Graham essay very recently, where he was talking about how essayists seem very confident, but the reason that they're confident is not kind of born out of like false bluster, but basically because they've thought about it a lot, and they've kind of like they've checked out all the possible ways in which they might be wrong, and then they remove those wrongs. And so by the time they publish it, what you see is that one sentence, but what you don't see is all the what if they were wrong, what if, like, all the questioning. And I kind of want to hear your experience with that, like with conjectures and criticism, and like your own personal experience. Like I guess where I would start is, do you remember your earliest questions as a child? Even like, what were how did you start?
I do remember some early questions. I don't know whether they are very illuminating. By the way, I think there's a theory of the mind,
Right.
of consciousness, and
Mm-hmm.
so on, which highlights self-awareness. In fact, some people even use self-awareness as the definition of consciousness and so on. And then they get very surprised when a dolphin can recognize its own
Right.
reflection in a mirror. and they're like,
Yes.
oh my God, dolphins have the same as we do. And
Right.
I don't think that thinking about one's thinking
Mm-hmm.
is often very helpful. I mean, there are special
Interesting.
situations where it is,
Interesting. Right.
but I think this thing about being in the flow that you mentioned,
Right.
that happens when you are thinking about the subject, the
Mm.
music, or
Yes.
the problem,
Right.
or whatever it is you're thinking about.
Yes.
That is occupying your consciousness, and
Mm.
you are not there.
Right. Yes.
You-
Yes. That's so funny.
and
Yeah, that's true.
so, and I think children
Mm-hmm.
uh, tend to be like that unless they're brought up against a
Right.
thing that forces them to
Right.
think about themselves. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what. So one of the first things I remember is I had just been taught. I'd previously been taught to count up to 10,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, this was in nursery school, and
Wow.
then we taught how to go up to 100.
Right.
And I remember being driven home in the car,
Mm-hmm.
and in the car thinking, does this go on forever or not?
That's wonderful.
And of course, a lot of mathematicians have thought that question and so on.
Right.
I didn't solve it. I remember
Right.
thinking about it, and then well, I don't know, maybe I did solve it. I came to the conclusion that the answer is yes, it
It
does
goes
go
on
on
forever.
forever. But I didn't
Right.
have really an argument about
Right.
that. I suppose it was just that having seen how you could go from 10 to 100,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I didn't see how that could stop.
Right.
Why the same thing? But apparently, Archimedes
Mm-hmm.
never quite dared to say
Oh
that
yeah,
it
I
won't
read that.
stop.
I read
Yeah.
the part where you mentioned that he seemed to not want to universalize,
Yes.
right, with the notation and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, what
Even
is
though
that
he
about?
invented these bigger and bigger, huge numbers,
Mm-hmm.
but it was always by this ad hoc parochial method,
Yeah,
which could have been extended infinitely, but he just didn't.
yeah, that's
Um,
so interesting.
yeah. So
It's interesting.
I think I say in the book, I think he may have been um, wanting an authoritative permission
Right,
from the
right,
culture or something.
right. Yeah,
And the
it's.
culture did not like
Mhm.
that kind of infinity.
Oh, this is beautiful.
Um,
I remember. So I'm a huge Richard Feynman fan as well, and I was
Ooh,
almost shocked a little bit when I saw that you pointed out that Feynman made a mistake when he was describing kind of like the future of physics, and that and like one of Feynman's
yes,
core, his kind of like the phrase that's tattooed in my brain is we should not fool. The first rule is you shouldn't fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool, right? He says that, and then he
yes,
goes on to make that kind of almost casual mistake that's such a gigantic mistake in a sense. And then I find myself, I'm writing in the margins, oh no, like if Feynman himself was not able to resist that, like what chance do I have? But I mean, it's it was
well,
something to
just
reflect
because
on.
he made a mistake doesn't mean he wasn't able to resist it.
Yeah, that's
Maybe
true.
all Feynman's works are really just transcripts of stuff he said.
Right.
How do you know that he didn't change his mind the next day?
That's true. That's true. Yeah. So we shouldn't be trying to not make mistakes, right? We should be making interesting mistakes and
Absolutely.
make more and more new and more interesting mistakes. And I love the way you
Yes.
put that. What if we called theories misconceptions, right? Because everything
Yes.
is a misconception, and we just have slightly better and better misconceptions.
Yes.
Yeah, that is something that's very cool.
And better problems.
Yeah. So what would you say is the problem on your mind right now when you're in the shower or when you're going about? Are you're working on a new book or?
Yes, I am. I'm working on the what will be the third in the trilogy.
Nice.
I mean, I don't know how long it's going to take. It always takes
Right.
longer than I think.
Oh,
And
yeah.
my previous two books took a hell of a lot longer than I thought. So,
Mhm.
I can't tell
Right.
when it'll be finished.
Mhm.
But it will talk more about issues of the mind and how the mind works. I mean, we don't know how the mind works, but
Right. In
issues
practice.
arising in psychology and
Right.
how psychology is connected to physics and computation, and there'll be stuff about constructors and
Right.
so on, other things that I have thought about since then. All those things raise fascinating problems, like
Mhm.
constructors, for example. There's the technical theory of them, which is very challenging, and then
Mhm.
there's the application of the universal constructor, and
Right.
then there's what the constructor tells us about, what constructor theory tells us about knowledge and so on, and then how it will affect how the universal constructor will affect the economy,
Right.
and whether constructor theory will be at all useful in making
Right.
real constructors,
Right.
and so on.
Mhm. Yeah. For my
And Go ahead.
like for my layperson friends and for me actually, how would you describe what a universal constructor is? Just casually.
Well, a universal constructor, the idea, I think, was invented by John von Neumann back in
Feynman.
the 1940s or something.
Mhm.
It is a machine, you
Mhm.
could say a robot,
All right. Yeah.
which can be programmed. So
Mhm.
it's a programmable robot
Right.
that can be programmed to convert some stuff into some
Mhm.
other stuff.
Right.
So it can convert, let's say, a pile of metal and plastic into a car.
Right.
That would be an example of a programmable constructor. It's
Right.
important. Programmable is important here because
Yeah.
you can just have a constructor as well, but the
Right.
real power of the theory comes with programmable constructors, and
Right.
then a universal constructor, which is a
Mm.
programmable constructor
Right.
that can convert
Mhm.
anything
Mhm.
into anything that's
Right.
permitted by the law, where the transition is permitted by the laws of physics.
Right.
So if the laws of physics allow it, it
Right.
can do it.
Yeah.
And usually a universal constructor would do an arbitrary task by first building another constructor, which builds another constructor.
Right. Right.
As this book by Larry Niven, where he describes this as the problem of how to build the tools to make the tools to make the tools to
Right.
make the thing we
Right.
want.
Interesting. Yeah. Oh, I just randomly remembered that. So my wife was in China for like several years ago for some trade fair, and like they have these massive trade fairs where they do sell the huge like factory robots that make the robots that make other things, and it's just
Ah,
like she
right.
was describing her sense of like how her mind was blown when you see the objects that you like, you see a can of soup and you're like, oh, I wonder how the can of soup was made, and you visualize, oh, it's in a factory, the cans are coming out, but you don't naturally think what made the thing that makes the cans of soup, right? And I guess
Yes.
a universal constructor would be able to produce those things at will for like a space colony or something, and just whatever is required,
Yes,
right?
from scratch. That's the thing.
Yeah.
When you get to a universal constructor, you have this
Mhm.
jump to universality,
Right.
where suddenly the repertoire,
Mhm.
instead of being a large repertoire, like, for example, a giant machine that makes robots, and
Right.
you can program it like a different kind of robot, but
Right.
it'll make it out of, it won't go and mine
Right.
the raw
Yes.
materials
Yeah.
and so on. But a universal constructor will be able to do that. It
Mhm.
will be able, if necessary, it'll be able to build a rocket which will go to an
Right.
asteroid, which will
Right.
mine the rare elements, which
Right.
will bring them back,
Mhm.
so on.
What I find
And the
yeah.
thing is, the difficulty of doing a particular task
Mhm.
then becomes only, once you've got a universal constructor, the only difficulty is to write the program.
Right.
So
Yeah.
everything becomes programming.
Right. Right. And
And
then once everyone is very skilled at programming, then it's what you can imagine to be the most
Yes.
effective use of.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you can be infinitely skilled. I mean, there will
All right,
always
that's
be
true.
scope for more and more and more skill
Yeah.
in
Right.
program, more and more
Right.
knowledge
Yeah.
of how to solve different manufacturing tasks.
Mhm.
But when you've written a program for the universal constructor,
Right.
that's it. Whether you want one of the item or a trillion, as long
Oh.
as you own the raw materials, you know, if
Right.
you can't
Yeah.
if you program it to steal someone else's raw materials, there'll be trouble.
Right.
But if you own that asteroid,
Mm-hmm.
then there is, once you've programmed how to make one of the objects,
Right.
you've programmed how to make any number. So we have our intuition about what manufacturing is will have to change.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Up to the time of the universal constructor, wanting more of something always meant more effort,
Right.
more human effort.
Right.
You had to have the theoretical knowledge as well. You as it were, the program, you know, how to do things, but it always required human effort as well. But once there's a universal constructor, then making one is the same as making a million.
Yeah.
And this will completely change the nature of the economy in ways that we totally can't predict at the moment, but it will be amazing.
Right. What I find myself thinking is what you're describing. So if we remove the universal aspect of the constructor, like you know, the present day status quo, like to someone from 20,000 years ago, like our current circumstances would seem like a very grand constructor made up of organizations and people and you know, supply chains, and you know, you put in an order, and then once we had emails, for example, like, so before emails and after emails, like the human scale constructor suddenly had like a big leap forward. Like suddenly you can put in orders quicker, and so this sounds like basically singularity stuff, right? Like it gets to the point where
I don't actually believe in the singularity, but it doesn't matter. Exponential growth is mind-boggling enough.
Right. Yeah. Functionally. Yeah. Even I think there's a quote that said something like, was it from you? I think I was just reading your book, so it's probably you who said that people. Yeah, it was you. People who can't imagine what they would do with more than 2 times their income. Like you kind of know what you would do if you had twice your salary.
That's a quote from David Friedman, actually.
Right. And then if you had 10 times your income, you would have to fundamentally reimagine what you would do, right? It's not just like, so if I doubled my income, I would renovate my kitchen. I would, you know, I have stuff in my mind. But if I had like 10, like 100 times more, I have to, oh my God, like what am I doing? I have to reconceptualize everything.
Yes, it might not be so good.
That's true. It can be a curse to, that's actually an interesting. I wonder if there are parallels between that and when we go all the way back to when we're talking about like fire and new technology, where, because in both cases, you know, so whether it's more money or new knowledge, like it's like having the new ability to do something you couldn't do before, and like how do you? It's dangerous, I guess, to figure out what's going to happen, or like now you may have made yourself a target in some way, right? A lot of people.
Well, if you got there by solving problems that you had, then you will already have the kind of mental infrastructure to know what to do with the 100 times the income.
Right.
You will have got that 100 times the income for a reason. It's because you have a project, you know, and so on.
Right.
But if you inherited it, if you inherited more money than you know what to do with, then it's dangerous. I mean, people do get unhappy from things. Sometimes they get happy, but
it's volatile.
Sometimes they get unhappy. Sorry.
Yeah, it's volatile, right? It's
it's unpredictable. And by the way, I think this is maybe going off the tangent, but I read recently about Silicon Valley billionaires keeping their children away from tech. And you know, not letting them have mobile phones and that kind of thing. I think that's a terrible idea. One of the great difficulties of being rich and having children
Right.
is bringing the children onto the on-ramp of how to live
Right.
happily with a lot of money. They might be able to do it because, as I said, they got there for a reason. Their children need help.
That's true.
And the absolute opposite of giving them help is keeping them away from it. Keeping them away from the money, the technology, the so on.
That's so true.
And you know, I think in the past, when there have been very rich people, and sometimes there have been dynasties of rich people, like the Rothschilds or
royal families.
But other times, well, no, that's different because they were solving a different kind of problem. But if we just talk about people in
wealthy, industrialized,
in the economy,
right?
Self-made billionaires or whatever.
Okay.
Sometimes the dynasty thing worked, but more often the offspring of the very rich person didn't know what to do. They couldn't continue the rich person's work, nor could they do something new.
Right.
And so this is the stereotype of them like wasting their money, and then the generation after that is back to normal.
Interesting.
And you know, if you wanted to, I think, you know, far be it from me to tell people what to do.
Right.
But I think that if you're a super rich person and you have children, one of the major challenges facing you is to give your children the means of being rich and happy, which means being rich and creative.
Right. Right.
And being rich can, if you don't have that knowledge, if you're not creative, it can make you kind of not able to make progress. It doesn't look like a poor person who's unable to be creative will starve. But a rich kid who is unable to be creative will just be unhappy. Right.
That is an interesting way of framing it. I like, that's interesting. And it's slightly surprising that this isn't a solved problem in a way. Like, when you so they have like financial planners and stuff, right? When you make that much money, people come to you with, here's how you manage. Like, somebody should be okay, and here's like the concerns for people with this amount of net worth. Like, I'm sure they have like private tutors and stuff, like for their
yes. But the trouble is they have conventional educational theory, which includes the bucket theory of the mind.
Oh dear.
And so they will think of the problem in completely the wrong terms.
That's true. Wow. I like how quickly that was obvious to you. That's true. Yeah, that makes sense. That is unfortunate because, like you said way earlier on, if we had creative, wealthy people, then they would be well positioned to accelerate us towards infinity, right? That is an interesting.
And we do
thing
have some, luckily.
Yeah.
but they are an enormous public good, and we could do with a lot more.
That's true. That is interesting. Wow, that's a lot to think about. That is I think one of the last things that I haven't gotten to ask you about yet that's in my notes is about the idea of rational versus anti-rational memes, which let me try and
anti-rational, I like to say.
So let me try and make sure let me try and make sure that I understand it properly. So I'm going from memory here, but so an anti-rational meme is something that it's an idea that's sticky, meaning that people who receive that idea keep it, and it makes them act not in their interests. Is that would you correct?
So both rational and anti-rational memes, by being memes means that they're sticky. That's already in the thing. Rational and anti-rational memes achieve their stickiness by kind of opposite methods. the anti-rational memes achieve their stickiness by depriving the holder of the ability to criticize them.
So there's a kind of authority.
Yes,
Right.
that's right. It sets up an authority, but it sets up an entrenched authority. So that thoughts that go along in the direction of maybe I should behave differently always get stuck, always get diverted into no, I can't, no, that's bad, no, I'm a bad, I would be a bad person, or whatever. That I will go to hell.
Right.
That kind of thought, and because the thoughts get diverted into that kind of channel, they can't get round to criticizing the thing that says do this, behave in this way, or don't behave in this way, whatever the meme says. That's how, and of course, being a meme, it has to, among other things, not only does it prevent you from criticizing, but it compels you to install the meme into other people.
Yes. Yeah.
So otherwise it wouldn't be a meme. If it was just in one mind, it would just be a hang-up.
Right.
To be a meme, it's got to be transferable to other people. And usually we only call something a meme if it's readily transferable into lots of other people.
Right.
A rational meme is the opposite. It's one that survives criticism, not disables criticism.
Right.
It's one which thrives in a critical environment because, as it were, because it's true, because it's useful. So people adopt it because they can improve their lives by using that idea or acting on that behavior, or whatever. Well, I've interrupted you, but
no. This is what I want to understand. So the difference between anti-rational, so anti-rational memes have that kind of self-protective mechanism. The meme has a protective mechanism and it spreads, whereas the rational meme welcomes criticism because, and I guess the thing about the rational meme is it has a certain proof of work in a way. There's something within that meme that persists despite criticism, right? So it has to be, like, I think you mentioned something about...
It's not even despite criticism. The criticism
clarifies,
is what helps to correct the errors. Otherwise, if you just try to copy a meme blindly without criticism, then mistakes will happen.
Yeah.
And eventually, it will not be the same meme. If the meme is, if a rational meme reproduces faithfully because it's being criticized, and the criticism itself is what makes the meme sticky, as you put it.
Right.
It's what makes it unchanged. Otherwise, it would gradually change. And for an anti-rational meme, what makes it sticky is that the criticism is disabled.
Right.
And so anti-rational memes do evolve by kind of dumb evolution in the same way that genes evolve. Anti-rational memes do not stay the same for thousands of generations.
Right. And that's right. What you just described, it's almost intrinsically cause for optimism, right? Because something that evolves through dumb replication should not be, I don't know, it feels, I need to, I'm sure if you work out the math in a way, or you game it out, there might be some circumstances where maybe the anti-rational memes overpower the rational memes by sheer volume, maybe. But as long as the anti-rational memes survive, eventually they should win out. It feels like
the rational memes survive.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's reminding me of how I once had a funny thought, which is that a lot of people play act their optimism, meaning they aren't fundamentally optimistic, or they haven't thought about whether or not they're really optimistic. It's just that they feel that being pessimistic is not nice, like socially, and so they feel like I should say optimistic sounding things like, oh, you should be hopeful for the future, but you don't really believe in it. It's not true. It's not grounded in honest belief. And it's always funny to encounter these things where, oh, like if that's true, then you should be optimistic. It's this, therefore that. It's like logical thing. Have you encountered that? Like kind of you're talking to somebody and then you realize that they're not actually optimistic until...
I'm not sure whether I have. Either way, I think it's much more common for people to be cynical.
Right.
In other words, artificial pessimism. Kind of,
right.
They're not really pessimistic. They just like the stance of being pessimistic.
Right. So
I guess certain politicians have an artificial optimism. And because in that context, cynicism is usually not beneficial to a politician. Right. Sometimes they are, you know, if you have prophets of doom, they can be cynical and be popular because of it. I don't know.
That's interesting. Wow. Okay. I think I have exhausted most of my questions for you.
Cool.
And I wonder if there's anything that I can kind of have like a overarching theme. I guess the big picture thing I wanted to talk to you about was optimism and parochialism. And yeah, I feel like we've addressed those things. I guess what like if I can get you to kind of have like a closing remarks on parochialism in the world, and you know, like for whoever watches, what's like your...
Yeah, well, like I said, we let's not put ourselves in the position of, you know, telling people not to be parochial or you know, whatever.
Yeah, it shouldn't.
Or even telling people that it's okay not to be parochial, or whatever.
Yeah.
I am encouraged by this conversation. You said at the beginning that you like talking to people coming from different intellectual directions. Yes. I forget how you put it. You put it very nicely.
Yeah, we have different.
I think we're
contexts.
coming from this. You and I seem to be coming from the same intellectual direction. So that's also sometimes nice.
Right. Trying to be rigorous, trying to be honest, trying to be correct, trying to criticize. Yeah. That's a very happy thing for me to hear, and it's a wonderful thing to close on, I think. I would encourage everyone who watches this, whether it's on YouTube or whatever, to check out The Beginning of Infinity. It's a great book. And thank
definitely.
you, David.
And we look forward to buy that.
Right. And I will look forward to your next one when you're eventually done with it. Thanks.